My son took me camping deep in Tungas National Forest, but at 2 a.m. I woke to find myself abandoned. No money, no car, no phone. Alone in the cold wilderness, I faced death. I survived, but what followed was darker. My revenge was nothing he could escape. Before continue, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you. My name is Richard, and I am 54 years old. Some people say age brings wisdom, but in my case, it brought silence. The kind of silence that comes when the people you love start drifting away, when the laughter at the dinner table fades into memory, and when your own child looks at you not as a father but as a burden. For most of my life, I thought I was doing everything right. I wasn't rich, but I worked like a mule to provide. I skipped vacations, skipped nights out with friends, skipped sleep itself, just to make sure my son Daniel had everything he ever asked for. Shoes that cost more than my week's paycheck, gadgets that I never even learned how to use, tuition for schools that I could barely afford. I told myself it was worth it. A father's duty, I thought, was to give until he had nothing left. I wasn't always this serious, though. In my younger years, I was a man of humor and charm, or at least I like to think so. I cracked jokes too often, embarrassed my son at parent-teacher conferences, and told corny stories at family gatherings. My wife used to roll her eyes, pretending to be annoyed, but I saw the corners of her lips fighting a smile. Back then, life had a warmth to it. But warmth has a way of slipping through your fingers if you don't hold it tight enough. My marriage didn't survive the storm of time, stress, and Daniel's constant demands. After she left, it was just me and him. I thought, at the very least, my son would stand with me, two men in a broken world, holding each other up. Instead, he became colder as the years passed. He grew into a man who measured everything in money, my worth included. I became the wallet, the fixer, the man who existed to clean up his messes. If he failed, he expected me to patch it. If he succeeded, he reminded me it was because of his own brilliance. I laughed it off at first. I told myself kids are like storms, wild and unpredictable, but they pass eventually. Yet, with Daniel, the storm never passed. It was strange, the way he carried himself. Sharp eyes, always scanning for opportunities, always calculating. There was no warmth left in him, none of the little boy who once used to fall asleep on my chest after watching cartoons. Sometimes, I stared at him and wondered if I had raised a stranger. People around me noticed too. Old friends hinted that he was using me, that I should stop giving in to his every demand. But I brushed them off. A father doesn't abandon his son, no matter how heavy the burden. That's what I believed. That's what I lived by. Still, in the quiet of my nights, when the house was too silent and my own breath sounded too loud, I felt it. The loneliness. The slow, steady realization that I was invisible to the one person I loved the most. A shadow in my own son's life. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs. The impatience when I spoke, the way he dodged my calls, the times he only showed up at my door when he needed money. But I chose blindness. Maybe I didn't want to accept the truth. Maybe I thought love was enough to fix him. I didn't know then that the boy I sacrificed everything for would lead me into the darkest night of my life. I didn't know he was already planning something that would change me forever. At 54, I thought I was just an old man trying to stay relevant in his son's life. What I didn't know was that I was about to become something else entirely, someone my son would never forget, no matter how hard he tried. That realization, however, would come later. For now, I was still the man I used to be, tired, hopeful, and tragically naive. When Daniel called me about the camping trip, I almost dropped the phone. Not because of shock, though, in truth, it was rare for him to call without needing money, but because of the way he said it. His voice carried a kind of excitement I hadn't heard in years. He told me he wanted to take me out into the wild, just the two of us, father and son, bonding under the stars. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. My son, who usually spent his nights in bars, poker tables, or glued to his phone, wanted to take me camping. It felt like a miracle. My heart swelled in my chest, and all the years of disappointment seemed to blur into the background. It was like someone opened a window in a room that had been suffocating with stale air. I didn't ask questions. I didn't wonder why, suddenly, after years of neglect, he wanted to spend time with me. A father's heart doesn't work with logic, it works with hope. And mine was starving for it. I rushed to prepare. I dug out my old backpack, the one I hadn't touched since I was in my 40s. I packed a flashlight, a warm jacket, some socks, and a tin of instant coffee I had saved for emergencies. I didn't bring much else. I thought Daniel would take care of the rest, and honestly, I trusted him. I wanted to trust him. The day arrived, and he pulled up in a sleek black car I knew wasn't his. He never kept one for long, always trading, always borrowing, always finding a way to slip out of responsibility. Still, I didn't question it. I climbed in, smiled like a fool, and told myself this was the start of something new. The drive to Tungas was long. We passed through winding roads that seemed swallowed by endless green. Trees stretched tall like ancient watchmen, their shadows casting eerie patterns across the car. The deeper we went, the quieter it felt. Not just in sound, but in spirit. Daniel barely spoke. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set, his fingers tapping the wheel whenever silence grew too heavy. I tried to fill the space with light chatter, stories from my youth, little jokes I thought might make him laugh. Sometimes, he gave a small chuckle, the kind that felt forced, like a coin tossed out of obligation. Other times, he didn't respond at all. I told myself he was just tired. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe this trip meant more to him than he was willing to say. My heart was too desperate to believe otherwise. Hours later, the forest thickened. Tungas isn't just a forest, it's a world of its own. The trees stretch so high they pierce the sky. Mist clings to the ground like a ghost that refuses to leave. The rivers run fast and cold, their voices louder than your thoughts. It's beautiful, yes, but also intimidating. Like nature itself is reminding you that you are small. When Daniel finally pulled over near a clearing by a rushing stream, I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years. The smell of pine filled my lungs. The air was sharp, clean, alive. I looked at my son and thought, maybe this was his way of coming back to me. We set up camp together. Well, mostly I did, while he scrolled through his phone, glancing up every now and then to nod or mutter a half-hearted approval. I didn't mind. Fathers don't mind. I told myself just being there with him was enough. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned into a canvas of orange and purple, I watched Daniel's face in the firelight. For a second, I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who once tugged at my shirt asking for another bedtime story. My chest tightened with pride, even if it was just an illusion. The fire crackled, sparks leaping into the night. I handed him a cup of coffee I made from my old tin. He took a sip, winced, and set it aside. I laughed it off. I told myself it didn't matter. He was here. That was what mattered. And yet, even in that warmth, something in his eyes unsettled me. He wasn't looking at the fire the way I was. He was looking past it, lost in thought, his lips pressed thin. There was an edge to him, a restlessness I couldn't name. If I had paid closer attention, if I had looked deeper, maybe I would have noticed it sooner. The sharpness in his gaze, the way his phone buzzed, and how he quickly turned it over to hide the screen. But I didn't. Because fathers don't see betrayal when they're blinded by love. That night, I believed I was about to get my son back. I thought this trip was a gift. I thought I was stepping into a memory we'd both cherish someday. I didn't know I was stepping into a trap. The forest has a way of swallowing sound. Once the fire began to burn low and the night wrapped itself around us, even our voices felt too small against the endless dark. The trees loomed like giants, their shadows shifting with every flicker of the flames, their branches whispering secrets I couldn't understand. For a while, I felt something close to peace. The kind that comes when the world slows down, when the only noise is the crackle of firewood and the rush of the nearby stream. I leaned back on the log we used as a seat and let myself breathe. The air was sharp and cool, so fresh it almost stung my lungs. I told myself, this is what I needed. This is what we needed. Daniel sat across from me, staring at the fire with a look I couldn't quite place. Not relaxed, not tired, not even thoughtful. Restless. His leg bounced against the dirt, his eyes darted now and then toward the car, and every few minutes, the faint buzz of his phone cut through the silence. He'd glance at the screen, smirk or frown, then slide it back into his pocket. I told myself not to pry. I was just glad he was there. At one point, I tried to share a story about his grandfather, the kind of rough man who could carve a spoon from a tree branch and cook a rabbit on a rock. When I was a boy, my father had dragged me into the woods for trips like this. I hated them then, but looking back, I realized those were the moments that stuck with me most. I thought maybe Daniel would appreciate hearing it. He laughed once, short and dry, then changed the subject to something about sports. I followed his lead, anything to keep the night smooth. Time moved strangely in that forest. One moment, it felt like midnight, the next it felt like the world had frozen. I didn't notice when Daniel's laughter faded completely, or when his words turned into silence. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to cold. The fire had died down, nothing but ash and embers glowing faintly. The forest was darker than I had ever seen, darker than any room or street could ever be. I sat up, shivering, calling softly for Daniel. No answer. At first, I thought he'd gone to relieve himself in the trees. But then I noticed it, his tent was gone. The spot where he had set it up was empty, like it had never been there. My chest tightened. I stumbled toward the car, but the clearing where it had been parked was bare. The car was gone. My bag was gone. My phone, my wallet, everything was gone. All that remained was the echo of the stream and the oppressive weight of the trees leaning over me like silent judges. It took a moment for my mind to catch up. I stood there frozen, my breath clouding in the air, my hands shaking. I whispered his name once, twice, then louder. But only the forest answered back, mocking me with its stillness. The betrayal didn't sink in right away. I told myself there had to be a reason, maybe an emergency, maybe he'd gone for help, maybe this was some twisted joke. But in my gut, I knew. He had left me. Stranded. Alone. The silence of the forest became unbearable. Every rustle of leaves felt like footsteps, every crack of a branch felt like something approaching. The trees seemed to move closer, suffocating me in their shadows. I wasn't just alone, I was abandoned, discarded, left behind like trash. Fear crept in slowly, then all at once. What if a bear came? What if wolves smelled me? What if I wandered in the wrong direction and froze before sunrise? My heart pounded so hard I thought it might wake the forest itself. I wanted to scream his name again, but the truth sat heavy in my throat. He wasn't coming back. That night, under the suffocating black canopy of Tungas, I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just shock. It was something deeper, colder, sharper. A realization that my son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had given everything to, had chosen to leave me to die. I didn't know how, or when, or even if I'd get out of that forest alive. But I knew one thing for certain. If I survived, I would never be the same man again. Fear doesn't arrive with a scream. It doesn't knock at the door or announce itself with thunder. It seeps in, slow and patient, until it fills every corner of your mind. That's what I felt as I stood in the clearing, staring at the empty spot where the car had been. My son was gone. My wallet was gone. My phone was gone. The only thing that remained was me, and the endless, suffocating forest. The silence of Tungas at night isn't silence at all. It's alive. Twigs snap under unseen paws. Branches sway when there's no wind. The stream nearby churns and growls as if mocking me. Every sound that broke the stillness stabbed at my nerves. I spun in circles, searching for Daniel, convincing myself I'd see him step out from the shadows with that smug grin he wore too often. But the shadows didn't move. For a moment, I thought maybe this was a prank. Maybe he'd left me here to scare me, and he'd be back in an hour laughing. That hope lasted all of 30 seconds, until reality sank its claws into me. He had left. Not by mistake. Not by chance. On purpose. He had stripped me of every lifeline and disappeared into the night. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet. My chest rose and fell too quickly, each breath sounding louder than it should have. I tried to call out his name again, but the word cracked in my throat. My voice sounded too small, too weak, swallowed by the endless trees. That was when the real fear started, the animal kind. The kind that tells you you're prey. I had read stories about this forest. Wolves prowling at night, silent and patient. Bears lumbering through campsites when they smelled food. Even the thought of getting lost in the dark, walking in circles until the cold claimed me, was enough to make my legs tremble. I had no map, no flashlight, no food, no water, just my thin jacket and the cruel realization that I had been discarded like garbage by the very person I raised. I thought about sitting by the ashes of the fire until morning. But the dark pressed in too close, and every sound made my heart lurch. What if something crawled out of that blackness? What if I never saw the sun rise again? So I walked. The trees crowded tighter the further I went, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, scratching my arms and face. Roots snaked across the ground, tripping me every few steps. My shoes sank in damp soil, the cold mud sucking at me like it wanted me to stay. The forest wasn't a place, it was a beast, and I had been tossed straight into its throat. With every step, my mind spun with questions. Why had Daniel done this? Was it just money? Did he think I had more hidden somewhere? Or did he simply want me gone, erased, so he wouldn't have to carry the weight of his old man anymore? The memories came then, unwanted and sharp. Him as a boy, tugging at my sleeve for candy. Him as a teenager, slamming the door after another argument. Him as a grown man, demanding money with that same stubborn fire in his eyes. All of it tangled together until I could barely breathe. And then the thought hit me, maybe he hadn't planned for me to come back at all. Maybe this wasn't abandonment. Maybe this was disposal. A clean way to get rid of the father he no longer wanted. That realization stopped me cold. The forest seemed darker, crueler, as though it had overheard the thought and agreed. My own son had fed me to the wilderness, confident it would finish what he started. I stumbled on until exhaustion wrapped itself around me. My legs ached, my throat burned with thirst, and my stomach cramped from hunger. I wanted to lie down and give in, to let the cold swallow me whole. But every time I considered it, I saw Daniel's face in my mind. Not the boy he once was, the man he had become. Arrogant. Uncaring. Certain he had won. That image kept me moving. One step at a time. Not because I believed I would survive, but because I refused to give him that victory. When dawn finally crept through the trees, pale and weak, I was still walking. My body was shaking, my lips numb, my thoughts scattered like dry leaves. But I was alive. Barely, but alive. And as the light pushed back the shadows, one thing became clear. If I made it out of that forest, I would never forgive him. The silence of that night never left me. It was more than absence of sound. It was the coldest silence I had ever known, the silence of betrayal, of being left to die by the person who should have been my only ally. That silence etched itself into me, a wound deeper than any knife could cut. And though I didn't know it then, it was the silence that planted the seed of revenge. Dawn did not arrive like a hero. It crept in slow, a thin smear of grey between the trees, just enough light to reveal how ugly the night had been. The ashes of our fire looked like the inside of a dead star. My hands shook as I rubbed them together, not because I thought it would help, but because doing nothing felt like inviting the cold to move in and start paying rent. The stream to my right kept talking in that impatient way water does when it has somewhere better to be. I decided to follow it. I remembered something from boyhood, a lesson I hated at the time. Water goes somewhere people like to be. Roads, cabins, docks. My father used to say that to me while shoving a walking stick into my palm and pointing toward a horizon I could never see. Now the words floated up out of memory like a rope thrown over a ledge. I took it. The ground here had no interest in cooperation. Roots rose like knotted veins, eager to trip me. Moss swallowed rocks and then pretended to be flat ground, a green smile hiding a twisted ankle. Every few steps my shoes slid in soft mud, and each slip sent a cold spike up my legs. The air smelled like wet bark and old rain. I would have loved it if I had not been starving, not terrified, not carrying a fresh hole in my chest where trust used to live. Hunger arrived first as a polite tap, then grew rude. My stomach argued with me out loud, a long complaint in a hollow drum. I tried to laugh, a dry cough at my own misery. Somewhere inside me, the kind man who always made a joke to keep the room light was still alive, but he sounded tired. I searched the edges of the stream for berries, anything familiar. A patch of orange-red salmonberries glowed like tiny lanterns. I tasted one, tart and shy. I ate a handful and forced myself to stop, the lesson echoing that too much of anything can turn on you. I rinsed my mouth with a sip from the stream and hoped the water was the fast, clean kind that forgives desperate men. Tracks crossed the mud near the bank, wide pads with claws. They were old, softened by drizzle, but seeing them rearranged my heartbeat. Bears. The forest is generous until it remembers it is not a museum. I scanned the trees and kept walking, talking silently to my feet like they were stubborn children. One more step. Then one more. Then another. By late morning, a fine rain started, the kind that looks gentle until you realize it has been stealing your heat grain by grain. I found a fallen spruce and crawled under its boughs, needles brushing my cheek like a rough blanket. For a minute I let myself feel small. I thought about my son, about all the times I let him step over my boundaries because I believed that was love. I had been a bridge he drove on every day, and bridges do not complain until they fall. The rain passed. I stood, careful with my knees, and broke a dead branch to use as a staff. It felt ridiculous at first, like play acting as a hiker, but the wood steadied me. I followed the stream until it split, one branch thin and noisy, the other wider and slow. I chose the wide one. Big water felt like a better bet, like taking the freeway instead of a back alley. Footprints appeared on a patch of sandy bank. Not mine. Boot treads. They were not fresh, but fresh enough to keep my pulse from sinking. Someone had passed this way. Maybe yesterday, maybe days ago. It was proof the forest was not empty of people, only stingy about showing them to me. The trees changed as I moved. Sitka spruce gave way to patches of hemlock, then back to spruce. A raven followed for a while, leapfrogging from branch to branch, curious and loud, as if auditioning to be my unwanted tour guide. I muttered in my head that if it wanted to be useful, it could fly ahead and send coordinates. The humor tasted like metal, but it kept me upright. Midday bent toward something dimmer. The light never fully brightened under that canopy. Every hour felt like evening pretending to be noon. My thighs burned. My lips cracked. I started counting steps just to stop thinking about how long the world could stretch when you were trying to survive inside it. I promised myself a reward at each 100, then stretched the number to 200, then 5. My prize was a single berry, or a minute leaning against a trunk, listening to my pulse beat in the wood. Memories came like weather. The soft one where Daniel fell asleep on my chest while a movie hummed. The hard one where he took cash off the dresser and denied it with that practiced innocence that only an expert liar can grow. The last birthday we shared, the smile he wore like a mask that did not fit. I wanted to scrub my brain clean. The forest did some of it for me. Pain is good at focusing a man on now. A sudden clearing opened, not large, but different enough to make the air feel wider. The ground flattened, more gravel than soil, with grass shouldering through. At the far edge, a thin line cut through the green. I stepped onto it and felt the ground change under my shoes. Hard, packed, artificial. An old road, maybe logging, the kind that loses the argument with the forest slowly but keeps a spine of stubbornness for years. I looked left and right. Both directions were a coin toss. My father's voice popped back up uninvited. Downhill is where people build things. I turned toward the faint slope and started moving. The road was a kindness wrapped in a trick. It saved my ankles but stretched into forever, curving just enough to hide what was next, a magician specializing in disappointment. Still, I could make distance now, actual distance, without getting dragged backward by roots. I walked until my calves switched to autopilot. A culvert appeared, a rusted mouth swallowing a small flow. Trash caught in the grate, nothing modern, just the ghosts of old plastic. Trash meant humans. Humans meant a chance. Clouds thickened again, a bruised lid sliding over the sky. The first rumble of thunder washed through the trees like a reminder that the world has louder problems than mine. I picked up the pace, breath rasping, the staff clicking a rhythm against the road. I tried not to think about night coming back. The light in these woods could vanish like a trick candle. Then I smelled it. Not the resin of spruce or the clean bite of rain. Smoke. Thin, distant, real. It hit the air like a thread I could tug with my nose. I stopped and closed my eyes to be sure. There it was, faint but pointed, drifting between the wet green smells. The staff turned from prop to weapon to guide all at once as I followed the scent downhill. The road kinked left, dipped, then climbed. My legs complained. My heart answered with a drum solo. I crossed another culvert and then saw a side path, barely a suggestion, grasses pressed, ferns parted. The smoke sharpened. I stepped off the road and pushed through, ferns flicking cold water on my arms. Branches tugging at my jacket, every snag a reminder that the forest charges a toll. The path widened, then widened again, and there it was, half hidden under alder and shadow. A cabin. Weathered wood. A stovepipe. A small stack of cut rounds under a lean-to, the kind of neat work that tells you the owner does not argue with winter. The door was shut. A window wore a film of old damp, but the glass was intact. Hope burst in my chest so fast I had to grip the staff to steady myself. I took 2 steps and the world tilted. I tried to call out. The sound that came out of me was not a word, not even close. My body had been negotiating with me all day and finally decided I was a bad business partner. My knees gave first, then my hands. The gravel was cold and generous with its edges. I felt them, strange and distant, like they were happening to someone else. The door moved, or maybe the shadows did. A shape leaned over me, blocking the flat sky. I saw a hat brim and a beard and a pair of eyes narrowed not in threat but in assessment, the way a medic might look at a stranger on the pavement. Warmth touched my shoulder, pressure lifting under my arm, then another arm around my back, and the smell of wood smoke took over everything. The last clear thought I had was a sentence I did not expect from myself. I am not dead yet. The second to last was a picture I did not invite, my son's face when he realizes I survived. The cabin swallowed me. Heat brushed the ice out of my bones one layer at a time. The world dimmed further, not darkness this time, more like mercy. As it closed in, I held tight to one small promise that felt like a nail hammered into the center of me. If I live through this, the man who walked into the forest will not be the man who walks out. When I woke, the first thing I noticed wasn't the roof above me, but the smell. Smoke and pine, mixed with something faintly metallic, like old tools left out in the rain. I blinked against the dim light filtering through a small window. My body ached in every joint, my throat felt scraped raw, but I was alive. That alone felt like a miracle. The cabin was small, 1 room, a stove in the corner, shelves lined with jars of preserves, and a rough wooden table scarred by years of use. I was lying on a cot, a wool blanket tucked around me, scratchy but warm. For the first time since that night in the forest, I didn't feel the cold gnawing at me. A man sat across the room, carving something out of wood with slow, careful strokes. He looked older than me, his beard thick and streaked with white, his skin weathered like bark. He didn't speak at first, just glanced up with eyes that seemed to have already seen everything there was to see in life. I managed a hoarse thank you, though my voice cracked halfway through. He nodded once, as if words weren't necessary. He brought me water in a tin cup. It tasted of iron, but it slid down my throat like salvation. Then he handed me a piece of bread, dense and rough, but the most precious food I'd ever held. I chewed slowly, each bite easing the emptiness in my stomach. I told him bits of what had happened. Not everything. I couldn't bring myself to admit that my own son had left me to die. The shame sat too heavy on my chest. Instead, I said I'd been stranded, that I'd lost my way. He didn't press me. He didn't ask the questions I dreaded. Maybe he already guessed the truth, or maybe he knew enough about pain to let a man reveal it on his own terms. He told me his name was Carl. He lived out here most of the year, fishing, trapping, and cutting timber. He spoke sparingly, in short sentences, like every word cost him something. But there was no judgment in his voice, no curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Just calm, steady. That night, lying by the crackling stove, I stared into the orange glow and let my thoughts spiral. Anger started to rise in me, not the wild panic of the forest, but something slower, colder. My son hadn't just left me behind, he had tried to erase me. And yet, here I was, alive, breathing, saved by the kindness of a stranger when my own blood had turned his back. Carl didn't say much before we slept, but as he stoked the fire, he muttered one sentence, low and almost to himself, "Don't waste your second chance." Those words rooted deep in me. They weren't advice. They were a warning. I closed my eyes, my body still aching, but my mind sharper than it had been in years. I had survived. Now it was Daniel's turn to feel what survival really meant. When Carl finally drove me back to town in his old, rust-bitten truck, the forest felt like it was spitting me out. The trees thinned, the air grew warmer, and the roar of the stream gave way to the faint hum of distant roads. Civilization was close. I should have felt relief. Instead, all I felt was heat, an anger that had been simmering since that night now burning steady in my chest. Carl didn't talk much during the ride. He kept his eyes on the cracked windshield, hands gripping the wheel like the truck was his anchor. The only sound was the rattle of the engine and the occasional cough from its tired lungs. Every so often, he'd glance at me, not with pity, but with the kind of look men give each other when they know words won't fix what's broken. When we reached town, he pulled up outside a small diner. He didn't offer advice, didn't ask for thanks. He just gave me a nod, the same steady nod he'd given when he found me half dead on the ground. It was his way of saying, "I've done my part. The rest is yours." I stepped out of the truck with legs that still shook, though not from weakness anymore. Weakness had been burned out of me in that forest. What remained was sharper, harder. I stood on the edge of the street, watching people move in and out of the diner. They laughed, they carried bags, they lived lives untouched by betrayal. For a brief second, I wanted to be one of them, to walk in, order a coffee, and pretend I was just another tired man with nothing heavier on his mind than the weather. But that wasn't me anymore. Instead, I found the police station. I told them my story, again, not the full truth. I said my son had abandoned me, taken my belongings, and driven off. They nodded politely, made notes, promised to look into it. But I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was just another sad old man with a family gone sour. They didn't understand what really happened in that forest. They didn't understand that this wasn't just abandonment. It was a death sentence my son had written with my name on it. And so I decided something important that day. I wouldn't rely on the law. I wouldn't rely on strangers. The system couldn't give me what I wanted. What I wanted was balance. What I wanted was for Daniel to feel the same helplessness, the same terror, the same cold silence I had felt when I realized I'd been left to die. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but I knew this much: revenge isn't loud. It's quiet, patient. It doesn't knock on the door and announce itself. It waits, it watches, it grows in the dark until the moment is right. Carl's words echoed in my mind as I left the station. Don't waste your second chance. I wouldn't. The man who had stumbled out of the forest broken and starving was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone who wasn't going to let betrayal end as a sad story told in whispers. No. This story wasn't ending with me. It was going to end with my son. The first few days back in civilization were strange. I had a roof over my head again, food on the table, the sound of passing cars outside my window. But no matter how warm the bed was or how loud the world around me became, I couldn't shake the weight of the forest. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, cold, hungry, abandoned, the trees pressing in on me while my son drove away with my life in his pocket. Anger alone, though, doesn't build revenge. Anger burns too fast. What I needed was patience, the kind that stretches, coils, and waits for the right moment. Daniel thought he had rid himself of me. I knew his kind of arrogance. It was the same smug look I'd seen when he bluffed through a poker game, the same grin he wore when he thought no one could see through his lies. He believed I was finished. And that, ironically, was my advantage. I started quietly. I didn't call him. I didn't let him know I was alive. Silence is a powerful weapon. It makes men uneasy. I knew my absence would make him wonder, though he'd never admit it. To him, silence would either mean I was gone for good or I was plotting something. Both possibilities would eat at him. But I wanted more than his unease. I wanted his world to collapse the way mine had in that forest. So I began to study him the way a hunter studies his prey. I knew Daniel's weaknesses better than anyone. He was greedy, impulsive, and desperate for shortcuts. Gambling had its claws in him deep. He chased easy money like a starving man chases scraps. He never could resist a shiny opportunity, no matter how dangerous or foolish. All I had to do was hold the bait in front of him and let him do the rest. So I reached out through old acquaintances, people who owed me favors, people who knew how to whisper in the right ears. A tip about an investment too good to miss. A rumor about a high-stakes game with an easy mark. A suggestion that someone was selling inside information that could make him rich overnight. I never spoke to him directly. My name never surfaced. The whispers were always distant, like echoes bouncing through the streets. And Daniel, true to form, couldn't resist. I heard from one contact that he'd thrown money into a business deal that evaporated within weeks. Another told me he had borrowed heavily from men you don't borrow from unless you enjoy broken bones. I didn't need to touch him. I just nudged the dominoes and watched them fall. The best part? He thought it was all his idea. He thought he was clever, chasing opportunities, building something. He had no idea that every step forward he took was actually a step deeper into the pit I was digging for him. At night, I would sit by the window, the city lights glowing faintly, and think of Tungas. The silence, the cold, the moment I realized he had left me. That memory didn't haunt me anymore. It fueled me. I wasn't rushing. Revenge isn't about speed. It's about making sure the lesson is learned. I wanted Daniel to feel the walls closing in, slowly at first, then all at once. I wanted him to taste the same fear I had tasted, to know the kind of despair that gnaws at you in the dark. He had left me with nothing in the middle of a forest. I was leaving him with nothing in the middle of his own life. And I was only just getting started. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. A man like Daniel could play confident for only so long before the mask began to slip. And when it slipped, it shattered. I heard the stories first. Whispers that he was behind on payments. That the friends he owed money to were no longer returning his calls with laughter, but with threats. The kind of men he thought he could charm didn't find him charming anymore. They wanted what was theirs, and Daniel had gambled it all away chasing shadows I had dangled in front of him. The apartment he bragged about online? Gone. Evicted after months of unpaid rent. His expensive car. Repossessed, taken in broad daylight, leaving him standing in the street like a man stripped bare. Even his phone, his precious lifeline to the world, was eventually cut off when he couldn't cover the bill. He fell fast. I made sure to watch it all unfold from a distance. One night, I stood across the street as he stormed out of his building, his belongings stuffed into trash bags, his face red with rage. He looked around, wild-eyed, as if the world itself had betrayed him. He screamed at the landlord, cursed at strangers passing by, then sat on the curb with his head in his hands. For the first time in his life, Daniel was small. Not the towering, arrogant man who once looked down on me. Not the son who thought himself untouchable. Just a broken boy in a man's clothes, staring at the ruins of the life he had built on lies and greed. I thought I would smile. I thought I would laugh, maybe even cheer inside. But standing there in the shadows, watching him unravel, I didn't feel joy. I felt something deeper, colder, sharper. Satisfaction. This wasn't entertainment, it was justice. Because this wasn't about revenge for me anymore. Not entirely. This was about balance. He had thrown me into the jaws of the forest with nothing but fear to keep me company. Now I had thrown him into the jaws of his own vices, and he had devoured himself. The silence of Tungas had taught me one thing: survival strips you bare. It shows you who you are when the world takes everything. And now, Daniel was learning that lesson. Though not in the wilderness, he was learning it in the heart of his own life, surrounded by people who once cheered for him and now walked past without a glance. I didn't approach him that night. I didn't need to. My presence wasn't required. His fall was complete, and he didn't even know I had been guiding the rope that pulled him down. As I turned away and disappeared into the city, one truth settled into my bones. Daniel had left me to die in the forest. But I had left him something far worse. I had left him to live with himself. I never spoke to Daniel again. Not a call, not a letter, not even a word carried through someone else's mouth. Some people think revenge is a shout, a clash, a final confrontation. They imagine two people screaming at each other, one triumphant, the other broken. But that's not how it works. True revenge is silence. It's watching from a distance as the same person who thought they held all the power slowly eats themselves alive. And Daniel, he was already chewing on the ruins of his life. I saw him only once more, by accident. He didn't see me. He was sitting outside a convenience store, thinner than I remembered, his hair grown wild, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. He had a paper cup in his hands, not filled with coffee, but held out for change. My son, the man who once laughed at me for working too hard for too little, now begging for scraps in the same city where he once strutted. I stood across the street, hidden in the flow of strangers. My chest ached, but not with pity. With clarity. This was the boy I had raised. This was the man who thought his father's love was an endless well to drink from until it ran dry. This was the son who had walked me into a forest at 2 a.m. and left me with nothing. For so long, I wondered if I had failed him. Maybe I gave too much. Maybe I never taught him limits. Maybe, in my desperation to be the father I thought he deserved, I had turned him into the man who betrayed me. But standing there, watching him cradle that paper cup like it was his last possession, I realized something: I hadn't failed. He had. Life had given him everything, and he had chosen greed. I had given him loyalty, and he had chosen betrayal. And now, life had balanced the scales in the cruelest way possible. I didn't cross the street. I didn't drop a coin in his cup or place a hand on his shoulder. That would have ruined everything. Mercy would have undone the lesson. Instead, I turned away, carrying with me the silence he had once left me in. Revenge hadn't brought me joy. It hadn't healed the wound. But it had given me something better: peace. Because I knew that the forest had changed me into a man who no longer begged for love or clung to hope. I no longer lived in the shadow of my son's choices. I had reclaimed myself. And maybe, just maybe, when he sits there on the curb, shivering in his thin jacket, staring at the faces of strangers who won't meet his eyes, he remembers that night in Tungas. Maybe he remembers the look on my face when I realized what he'd done. Maybe he feels, even for a moment, the silence of the forest pressing down on him. That would be my final gift to him. Not money, not shelter, not forgiveness. A lesson. Because in the end, a father's duty is to teach his son. And Daniel finally learned what I had tried to teach him all along: the world gives nothing for free. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you.